In December 1944, the strategic map of the Western Front showed General George S. Patton's Third Army grinding east toward the Saar. Then, a surprise German offensive shattered American lines to the north, completely isolating the vital road hub of Bastogne. On paper, the massive arrow representing Patton's forces simply snaps 90 degrees north to break the encirclement. It looks effortless, but on the ground, pivoting an entire field army during a freezing winter offensive is a logistical nightmare that should take weeks. How do you force tens of thousands of men, artillery, and fuel trucks to instantly change direction before a trapped city runs out of time? This is not merely the story of the 101st Airborne holding the line, nor is it another biography of a famous general throwing tanks at a problem. It is the anatomy of a massive, almost impossible operational pivot. To understand what happened in those freezing days of December 1944, you have to understand what a field army actually is. It is not just a collection of infantrymen and armored vehicles that can turn on a dime. It is a sprawling, industrial-scale organism stretching for miles. When you order an army to turn 90 degrees, the tanks and the riflemen are the least of your problems. You have to move the artillery battalions and their massive stockpiles of heavy shells. You have to relocate the field hospitals, the signal corps laying miles of wire, the engineers with their bridging equipment, and the massive supply dumps of fuel and rations. Every single one of these elements is already heavily committed, moving on established road networks oriented toward a completely different objective. The enemy isn't just the German army, it is physics, friction, and the sheer weight of your own logistics. The conflict here is the immense, grinding mass of an entire American field army slammed against the ticking clock of a surrounded city that is rapidly running out of ammunition and blood. The question is not just whether the Third Army could fight its way through. The question is, how did Patton and his staff physically execute this gigantic 90-degree realignment fast enough to punch a corridor open before the Bastogne pocket ceased to exist? The urgency of that question was born on the morning of December 16, 1944, when the illusion of a quiet winter suddenly shattered. Under the cover of a dense, freezing fog, 3 German armies comprising hundreds of thousands of men and a massive concentration of panzers slammed into a thinly held stretch of the Ardennes forest. The American lines buckled, splintered, and gave way. The German High Command had engineered a desperate, lightning-fast thrust designed to split the Allied forces in two and drive all the way to the Belgian port of Antwerp. But to make this massive armored spearhead work, the German war machine required one resource above all else: speed. And in the dense, heavily wooded, and sharply ridged terrain of the Ardennes, speed meant roads. This geographical reality is why a quiet Belgian market town suddenly became the absolute center of the world. Look at a topographical map of the region, and Bastogne does not look like a traditional military fortress. It sits in a shallow bowl, surrounded by hills. But look at the asphalt and dirt carving through those hills, and the town's true strategic value becomes blindingly obvious. 7 major roads converge squarely in the center of Bastogne, like spokes meeting at the hub of a wooden wheel. In a region where mechanized columns are easily bottlenecked by narrow logging tracks, deep ravines, and dense pine forests, whoever controls Bastogne controls the flow of modern warfare. For the German panzer divisions to maintain their strict, unforgiving timetable, they had to swallow Bastogne, route their heavy supply trucks through its intersections, and push rapidly west. Without the town, the German offensive would be forced onto secondary dirt paths, burning precious fuel, stalling in the mud, and inevitably choking to a halt. Realizing this, American forces scrambled into the town to block the intersection. Airborne infantry, remnants of shattered armored battalions, and straggling artillery crews formed a hasty, desperate perimeter. But the German tide simply flowed around them, bypassing the heavy resistance to seal the perimeter. By December 20th, the trap snapped completely shut. Bastogne was surrounded, an island of American resistance rapidly drowning behind enemy lines. Inside the pocket, the terrifying reality of isolation set in with brutal speed. A heavy, relentless winter overcast grounded Allied cargo planes, cutting off any hope of resupply from the air. Artillery batteries began rationing their high explosive shells to single digits, firing only when German tanks were practically on top of them. Medical units, stripped of blood plasma, morphine, and clean bandages, were reduced to using local cognac to treat the mounting waves of wounded men. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, turning the muddy foxholes into concrete, and the defenders dug into the ice, shivering, bleeding, and waiting. The Germans did not just intend to bypass the town indefinitely. They began systematically crushing it from all sides to clear the vital intersections. The men inside Bastogne were buying time with their lives. But that time was rapidly running out. For the trapped defenders, survival now depended entirely on outside intervention. But when Allied planners looked across the strategic map for salvation, the picture was grim. The most potent armored force in the European theater, George S. Patton's Third Army, was located roughly 100 miles to the south. And the Third Army was not sitting idle in winter quarters, resting in a staging area, or waiting for a phone call to act as a rescue column. It was a massive, violent organism, actively engaged in a grueling offensive of its own. Patton's forces were locked in heavy, relentless combat, pushing methodically east toward the Saar region and the formidable concrete bunkers of the German Siegfried Line. To understand the sheer impossibility of what would soon be asked of them, you must visualize the physical posture of the Third Army on that day. An attacking field army is deeply entrenched in its own forward momentum. Hundreds of thousands of men were leaning east. Every rifle company, tank battalion, and artillery battery was tightly engaged with a shooting enemy. Behind those frontline combat troops stretched a colossal logistical tail, entirely hardwired for eastward movement. Massive supply dumps holding millions of gallons of aviation fuel, diesel, and gasoline were geographically positioned to feed an eastern advance. Thousands of tons of 155mm artillery shells were neatly stacked in depots oriented for targets in the Saar. The intricate nervous system of the army, hundreds of miles of copper telephone wire painstakingly laid by the signal corps, was strung strictly east to west. The entire traffic control grid, enforced by military police at every muddy crossroads, was rigidly engineered to push combat replacements eastward and evacuate the wounded westward. Heavy pontoon bridges had been staged for this specific axis of advance. Road networks had been prioritized, mapped, and assigned based on the absolute assumption that the Third Army would continue smashing its way into Germany. To intervene in Bastogne, Patton could not simply peel off a few Sherman tanks, point them up a highway, and wish them luck. He would have to physically halt an offensive involving hundreds of thousands of men. He would have to issue orders for frontline units to break contact with a firing enemy. Historically, one of the most dangerous and delicate maneuvers in warfare, and pull back without triggering a chaotic collapse of his own lines. Then, he would have to execute an unprecedented nightmare of traffic management. The heavily armored spearheads, currently at the very front of the eastern push, would have to stop, turn around, thread their way back through their own tightly packed supply columns, cross perpendicular to the established flow of traffic, and completely reorient themselves toward the north. A single armored division on the move requires over 70 miles of road space. Now imagine taking several of these massive columns, stopping them in the freezing mud, and forcing them to navigate a sudden 90-degree turn on narrow, icy roads, barely wide enough for two trucks to pass each other. And the tanks could not go alone. A tank without infantry support is quickly destroyed. A tank without a fuel truck is a stationary pillbox. A tank without heavy artillery support is blind. The entire circulatory system of the Third Army, the 2.5-ton supply trucks, the mobile field hospitals, the heavy bridging equipment of the combat engineers, the massive recovery vehicles needed to tow broken armor out of ditches. Every single piece of this sprawling industrial machine had to be uprooted, turned sideways, and shoved north into the freezing Ardennes. If the timing was off by even a few hours, the resulting friction would be catastrophic. Convoys of rushing fuel would collide with columns of retreating wounded. Heavy artillery units would find themselves blocking the path of advancing armored divisions. The intricate, delicate clockwork of the army would jam, leaving thousands of vehicles frozen on icy roads, creating the largest traffic jam in military history, and offering a helpless, static target for German guns. Halting an active campaign of this magnitude and violently wrenching its axis of advance across a treacherous winter landscape was an operational gamble of staggering proportions. It meant abruptly abandoning the hard-fought, bloody gains in the Saar, risking the sudden collapse of the Southern Front and throwing a highly complex logistical machine into deliberate chaos. It was not a maneuver a field commander, even one as aggressive as Patton, could undertake quietly on his own initiative. A pivot of this scale, ripping an entire army out of one battle to hurl it into another, fundamentally altered the geometry of the Allied war effort in Europe. An earthquake of this magnitude required the absolute highest level of strategic authorization. The fate of the starving, freezing men surrounded in Bastogne now hinged on a single critical meeting of the Allied High Command, where the only question that mattered was how fast a rigid, eastward-facing war machine could be torn apart and rebuilt to fight in the north. On December 19th, in a damp, heavily guarded barracks in Verdun, France, the Supreme Allied commanders gathered to confront the collapsing front. General Dwight D. Eisenhower surveyed the room. The situation maps spread across the tables painted a terrifying picture. The German salient was swelling rapidly, and Bastogne was in imminent danger of being swallowed entirely. Eisenhower needed a counterattack, a massive hammer blow driven into the southern flank of the German Bulge to relieve the pressure and rescue the trapped defenders. He turned to General Patton and asked the critical question: how long would it take for the Third Army to disengage from its eastward offensive, pivot north, and attack? The men in the room, experienced combat commanders and logistical experts, were doing the mental math. Disengaging heavily committed divisions in freezing weather, rerouting supply lines, and moving them over icy roads was a massive undertaking. They expected Patton to ask for a week. Perhaps, if pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, he might promise 5 days. Patton looked at Eisenhower and stated he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. It sounded impossible. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, suspecting it was merely a reckless boast from a famously flamboyant general, a promise that would result in a disorganized, piecemeal attack arriving too late to save anyone. But what the officers in Verdun did not know was that Patton's promise was not a spontaneous gamble. It was the payout of a meticulously calculated contingency plan. Days earlier, while the Allied intelligence apparatus was still dismissing the German buildup in the Ardennes as a defensive measure, Patton's own intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, had noticed a disturbing pattern. Koch tracked the movement of German rail traffic, the withdrawal of panzer divisions from the Russian front, and the silent massing of enemy armor just across the border. He had warned Patton that a major German strike was imminent. Patton didn't just listen, he acted. Before the German offensive even began, he quietly ordered his operational staff to draft plans for pulling the Third Army out of its eastward drive and slamming it north. While the bulk of the army was actively fighting in the Saar, a small group of staff officers, working in absolute secrecy, began mapping out the impossible pivot. They calculated the precise road capacities. They identified which divisions could be pulled off the line the fastest. They drafted the movement orders, leaving only the dates blank. They pre-planned the locations for new fuel dumps and ammunition staging areas. When Eisenhower asked his question in Verdun, the monumental staff work was already done. Patton was not making a wild guess. He was reading off a timetable that his logisticians and operations officers had already confirmed was mathematically achievable. As soon as Eisenhower authorized the maneuver, Patton stepped to a phone and issued a simple, prearranged code word to his headquarters. That single phone call triggered a logistical earthquake. The blank dates on the movement orders were filled in. The telegraph lines hummed with priority transmissions. Instantly, the command rippled down the chain. Division commanders received abrupt orders to break contact with the enemy. Quartermasters were told to halt all eastward shipments and violently reroute their supply chains north. The massive machinery of the Third Army shuddered, stopped, and prepared to throw its sheer physical weight onto the narrow, icy roads leading toward Bastogne. The promise had been made in Verdun. Now the brutal reality of execution began. The moment that code word was spoken, the theoretical geometry of the pivot collided with the brutal physical reality of the Ardennes winter. The single greatest enemy of the Third Army was no longer the German Wehrmacht. It was the sheer friction of moving thousands of tons of metal across narrow, icy roads in blinding snow. In the first hours of the pivot, the roads themselves threatened to destroy the operation before a single shot was fired. The Ardennes road network was a spiderweb of narrow logging trails and tight, winding village streets, totally unsuited for the immense volume of heavy military traffic now suddenly forced upon it. Imagine the chaos. You have massive M4 Sherman tanks, each weighing over 30 tons, trying to navigate sharp, icy corners. You have long convoys of 2.5-ton supply trucks, heavily laden with fuel and ammunition, desperately trying to maintain speed. You have massive artillery tractors towing heavy howitzers, mobile field hospitals, and heavy bridging equipment, and all of this had to move simultaneously, often in the dark, under blackout conditions, over roads covered in slick ice and deep mud. A single broken axle on a fuel truck could block an entire division. A tank sliding off an icy bridge could sever a critical supply artery for hours. The margin for error was absolutely zero. This is where the unsung heroes of the pivot emerged, the military police and the traffic control teams. These men were thrown into the freezing intersections and told to perform the impossible. They physically wrestled the chaos into order. They stood at crucial crossroads for hours in the freezing cold, waving flashlights, screaming orders over the roar of engines, and literally forcing the massive convoys to maintain separation. They had to prioritize the flow. Combat units first, then immediate ammunition and fuel, then everything else. They rerouted convoys around blocked roads, untangled massive traffic jams caused by exhausted drivers, and enforced a ruthless discipline on the movement. The MPs were the physical mechanism that made the staff work a reality. Without their sheer force of will at those icy crossroads, the 90-degree turn would have ended in a colossal, static traffic jam stretching for miles. As the spearheads ground their way north, a dual countdown began ticking with terrifying speed. Inside the surrounded Bastogne pocket, the situation was rapidly deteriorating from desperate to critical. The weather remained a thick, impenetrable blanket of overcast, grounding the C-47 transport planes and denying the defenders any hope of aerial resupply. The men of the 101st Airborne and the shattered armored units were running on fumes. Artillery batteries were counting their remaining shells by the dozen. When a German tank appeared, the gunners had to wait until it was practically at point-blank range before firing, conserving every round. The medical situation was horrific. With the field hospitals captured early in the encirclement, the wounded were crammed into basements and churches. There was no plasma, there were no clean bandages. Surgeons operated by the dim light of flashlights, using anything they could find, including local cognac, to clean wounds and dull the pain of amputations. The defenders were freezing in their shallow foxholes, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for the next German assault. They knew they were holding the critical road hub, but they had no idea if help was actually coming or if the Third Army was just a rumor. Simultaneously, roughly 100 miles to the south, the leading elements of Patton's relief force, the 4th Armored Division, were slamming into the German blocking positions. The 4th Armored wasn't just driving down an empty highway. They were fighting a brutal, grueling battle every inch of the way. The Germans, realizing the threat developing on their southern flank, had hurriedly rushed units to block the approaches to Bastogne. They occupied the high ground, the ridges, and the crucial crossroads. The American spearheads had to fight through these heavily defended positions, while the rest of the Third Army was still in the chaotic process of turning and moving up behind them. This was the terrifying reality of the pivot. Patton was attacking while his army was still off balance. The 4th Armored would push forward, encounter a German anti-tank screen hidden in a snowy tree line, and a brutal firefight would erupt. The tanks would need infantry support to clear the woods, but the infantry might still be stuck in a traffic jam 5 miles back. They would need artillery fire to suppress the German guns. But the artillery batteries might still be displacing forward, trying to find a solid firing position in the frozen mud. Every destroyed bridge, every undetected minefield, every well-placed German 88mm gun cost the American advance precious hours. And every hour lost on the roads south of Bastogne meant more casualties and less ammunition for the men freezing in the pocket. The system had to keep moving, regardless of the cost. From the German perspective, the initial arrogance was rapidly turning into deep structural anxiety. When the German High Command first launched the Ardennes offensive, they had fundamentally miscalculated the American ability to react. They looked at the map, saw the Third Army deeply committed in the Saar, and assumed that it would take the Americans weeks to untangle themselves, form a coherent plan, and launch a counterattack. They believed they had a wide, open window to crush Bastogne, secure the road network, and drive to Antwerp. But suddenly, their intelligence reports started painting a terrifyingly different picture. The American units in the Saar were vanishing. Massive convoys were spotted moving north. The southern flank of the German Bulge, which they had assumed would be relatively secure, was suddenly under immense pressure. The German commanders realized that Patton was not just sending a token rescue column. He was throwing the entire weight of a field army against their exposed underbelly. This realization forced a drastic, desperate change in German strategy. They had to crush Bastogne immediately, before the American relief force could break through. The attacks on the pocket intensified, becoming frantic and uncoordinated. German infantry and armor threw themselves against the American perimeter, trying to find a weak point, trying to shatter the defense before the clock ran out. The German offensive, designed to sweep westward to the sea, was now being violently sucked into the vortex of Bastogne and the rapidly approaching Third Army. The very geometry of the battle was changing. The Germans were no longer just pushing west. They were desperately trying to defend their southern flank from a massive, unexpected threat. For the American vanguards, the pressure was immense. The men driving the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division knew exactly what was at stake. They knew that if they stopped to wait for perfect logistical support, if they halted to consolidate their positions, the men in Bastogne would die. They had to keep pushing, trading casualties and equipment for speed. They drove their tanks until the engines overheated. They fought through exhaustion, the freezing cold, and the constant grinding fear of ambush. They understood that the massive, complex machine of the Third Army, the staff work, the logistics, the traffic control, was all designed to put them at the tip of the spear, and now they had to deliver. The pivot was not just a logistical miracle. It was a brutal, bloody fight to force a physical path through a determined enemy. This massive 90-degree turn was doing far more than just pushing a rescue column up a road. It was fundamentally altering the entire strategic balance of the Winter War, setting the stage for a collision that would decide the fate of the Ardennes offensive. The sheer speed of the American pivot triggered a catastrophic shift in the fundamental geometry of the entire German offensive. The grand design of the Ardennes strike had been built entirely on an east-to-west axis. The German High Command had engineered a massive, deep salient to punch straight through to the Meuse River and onward to Antwerp. They had anticipated resistance in front of them, but they had fundamentally calculated that their southern flank, the long, exposed underbelly of the Bulge, would remain relatively safe while the Americans spent weeks reorganizing. Instead, within days, a massive eastward-facing American field army had violently wrenched itself 90 degrees and was now driving straight up into that vulnerable southern flank. The Germans were abruptly forced to stop looking west and desperately scramble to look south. The troops in armor originally earmarked to exploit the breakthrough and race toward the Meuse had to be frantically diverted to hold ridges, block crossroads, and defend against Patton's advancing spearheads. The momentum of the entire German offensive was being bled out to protect its own flank. But this aggressive, relentless American pressure was extracting a punishing toll on the Third Army itself. The operational advantage Patton secured was not won through magical logistics. It was paid for in heavy casualties, staggering fuel consumption, and severe mechanical attrition. The 4th Armored Division and the supporting infantry units were not simply rolling over the enemy. They were throwing themselves against hastily prepared but lethal German anti-tank screens hidden in the dense, snowy forests. To maintain the brutal pace required to reach Bastogne before it collapsed, American commanders were forced to accept steep losses. Tanks were being knocked out, and infantrymen were falling in bitter, freezing firefights for unnamed stretches of icy road. The wear and tear on the machinery was equally severe. Tanks and trucks, forced into continuous operation without proper maintenance in sub-zero temperatures, were breaking down. Fuel dumps, hastily relocated and struggling to keep up with the advancing columns, were draining at an alarming rate as heavy vehicles churned through mud and snow. This was the true cost of the pivot. The Third Army was burning its own combat power to buy speed. Yet, the brutal calculation held. The primary operational advantage lay not in achieving a flawless, bloodless maneuver, but in executing a chaotic, grinding realignment faster than the German command loop could process it. The American staff system, despite the friction and the losses, was reorganizing and deploying a massive field army at a pace the German offensive had deemed mathematically impossible. The race was no longer just about reaching Bastogne. It was about forcing the German salient into a fatal culmination before the trapped defenders broke. That fatal culmination finally cracked on the afternoon of December 26th. The grueling, bloody countdown that had dictated every movement of the Third Army reached its absolute breaking point. Elements of the 4th Armored Division, battered, exhausted, and running on little more than sheer momentum, finally punched through the last German blocking positions south of Bastogne. The physical barrier between the trapped defenders and the advancing relief force was shattered. Contact was established. But this first physical link-up was not the cinematic conclusion of a siege. It was not a magical moment where the tanks rolled into the town square and the battle instantly ended. The corridor that Patton's spearheads had just torn through the German lines was incredibly narrow, barely a few hundred yards wide in some places. It was a fragile, dangerous artery, completely exposed and under near constant German artillery fire. The ridges overlooking the road were still heavily contested. The fighting did not stop. In many ways, it intensified, as the Germans desperately tried to sever the connection and reseal the pocket. Yet, despite its extreme fragility, the absolute hermetic seal of the German encirclement was officially broken. And in modern warfare, the difference between a surrounded pocket and a pocket with a single, heavily contested supply line is the difference between annihilation and survival. Almost immediately, the fundamental dynamics of the Winter War shifted. Through that narrow, dangerous corridor, the lifeblood of the defense began to flow. Vital ammunition trucks, driven by men who knew they were traveling a targeted road, pushed their way into the town. They brought desperately needed artillery shells, allowing the guns inside Bastogne to finally answer the German barrages with sustained fire, rather than rationed single shots. Medical supplies, plasma, bandages, and morphine finally reached the freezing basements and churches. And, crucially, for the first time in over a week, the mounting casualties, the wounded men who had been lying in the dark, shivering and waiting, were loaded onto ambulances and trucks and evacuated south. The psychological weight of the siege was lifted, even as the tactical reality remained incredibly dangerous. Patton had not ended the battle for Bastogne. He had broken the seal that made its destruction inevitable. The threat of absolute annihilation was gone. Now, as the corridor stabilized and widened under the immense, grinding pressure of the advancing Third Army, the sheer scale of what had just been accomplished began to come into focus. Looking back at the strategic map from mid-December, that single, heavy arrow representing the Third Army, snapping 90 degrees north, looks like a simple command decision. But on the ground, that arrow was composed of tens of thousands of men, thousands of tons of steel, and miles of deeply entrenched supply lines. The ability to violently redirect that massive, industrialized force during a freezing winter offensive represents one of the most astonishing logistical and command achievements in modern military history. An operation of this magnitude could never have been executed if it relied solely on the aggressive instincts of a single commander in the heat of the moment. The true foundation of the pivot was laid days before the first order was issued. It was built on the anticipation of intelligence officers who read the subtle signs of a German buildup. It was forged in the meticulous, secret contingency planning of staff officers who calculated road capacities and drafted movement orders before the crisis even broke. When the decision was finally made, the speed of the maneuver relied on the ruthless execution of quartermasters rerouting fuel and ammunition, and the military police who stood in freezing intersections, forcing order onto chaos. The defense of Bastogne was not a rescue mission, where a helpless garrison waited for a savior. The 101st Airborne and the shattered armored units held the town through sheer endurance and incredible tactical discipline. They bled for every intersection and bought the one resource the Third Army desperately needed: time. Bastogne survived long enough for Patton's army to reach it, and the sprawling system of the Third Army turned fast enough for that survival to matter. The fatal flaw in the German offensive was not just a lack of fuel or bad weather. It was a profound underestimation of the American operational machinery. The German High Command believed the Bastogne pocket was isolated because the primary American force was facing the wrong way. They assumed that pointing east meant a field army was locked in place for weeks. They failed to grasp how rapidly a fully motorized army, driven by an aggressive command structure and highly competent staffs, could completely rewrite its own operational reality. Germany had surrounded Bastogne entirely confident that the pocket was effectively isolated and doomed to a rapid collapse. George S. Patton did not simply send a rescue column to save them. He violently changed the direction of an entire field army. On the strategic map, it was a sudden 90-degree turn. But on the frozen ground of the Ardennes, it was tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of heavy guns tearing apart their own battle lines to change the geometry of the Winter War, arriving just before Bastogne finally ran out of time.